In this video, we'll build a responsive carousel image slider with HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap. Okay guys, so let's take a look at the responsive image slider that we're going to build. And as you'll see on the full width version, we're going to have this content on top of two of the slides, but on the mobile version, we're not going to have that content appear. So we're going to decrease it in size as the image slider gets smaller, and eventually it's going to disappear on the mobile version. So as you'll see when I size the website down, the content inside of the image slider will be resizing in terms of the size of the text as well as the width of the content. Then when we size the screen back up, the text content will increase in size as well as the background width that it sits on top of. You might also notice that the indicator buttons at the bottom of the image slider will increase in size as we flex the window up, and we'll be changing that in the CSS. So before we check out the files that we'll need to get started with the tutorial, my goal for this video is to get up to 80 likes. And if you end up liking the video, please remember to subscribe and turn on your notifications for new tutorials. In the description of this video will be the starter files that I've prepared for the tutorial, and I'm going to be using the free program Visual Studio Code as my text editor. So if you're unfamiliar with Visual Studio Code, I've included this file called 12websitebundle.html, which you can click on, and the links for the image and the button in this will bring you to my website, where I'm going to show you the resources page where I have a lesson on Visual Studio Code. So if we select the resources link from the navigation, and then go down to the Visual Studio Code lesson on the left, here you'll see all of the extensions that I use, as well as all of the settings that I use in Visual Studio Code, and the video there will show you how to import them. Also, before we go and check out the files in Visual Studio Code, the website that we'll be building today is one of the 3 websites included as a bonus to the 12 website bundle pack that was seen on the front page of my website. So I'm going to move the starter files window off to the side, and let's go over to Visual Studio Code and see what's already included for us inside of index.html and style.css. So I'm not going to go over every meta tag included for us here. We'll just cover the files that we're linked to as well as Google Fonts. So we have the bootstrap min.css file for the Bootstrap framework, as well as style.css, which we'll be working on. And then at the bottom here inside of the head section, we have a link to Google Fonts, which is the Roboto Google font style that we'll be using. If we hit Command B here in Visual Studio Code, we'll be able to see all of the files and folders. So as we saw, we have the CSS folders for the Bootstrap framework as well as style.css. Then at the bottom here, we have the latest version of jQuery to be compatible with the Bootstrap min.js file, which is required for the image slider, which you see the images for here inside of the image and carousel folders. Then moving over to style.css, at the very top, we're going to have a reset style, which will give us our font family, as well as making the font large in size, which will bring the font from 16 pixels to 18 pixels in Google Chrome. Then moving down, we have some media queries started for us for where we'll add our responsive CSS to make our content smaller as the screen size gets smaller. And at the very bottom, we have a cheat sheet for the Bootstrap responsive breakpoints. So now back in index.html, I'm going to select the Go Live feature in the bottom right-hand corner to start the live server extension inside of the text editor. And that's going to open up in Google Chrome with this blank page. So just to make sure that we're connected, we can add some text here. And if I save it, which is the setting I have set up in Visual Studio Code, as opposed to autosave, we'll see the text appear on the left. So now we're ready to start adding some content for our image slider, starting with the tag or element, which will wrap around the entire slider and nest everything that's inside of it. So we're going to give this an ID from Bootstrap called Carousel. And then after that, we're also going to add a class called Carousel and a class called Slide. And these two classes will interact with the Bootstrap JavaScript library to enable the image slider. Then for the closing div, since this is going to wrap around everything, I'm going to move that to the end image carousel HTML comment. Then with this element, we'll need to set some data attributes to get the data slide or the carousel sliding, as well as the speed or interval that it moves at. So we're going to say data-ride carousel And then we're going to give it an interval with data-interval. And for now, we're just going to make it 650ths of a second. So later, once we add our images, we'll change that to get the speed that we're seeing here with the finished version. Next, in index.html, let's add the parent element, which will contain the carousel items, which will have our images inside of it. So this is going to be a class called carousel-inner. And then I'm going to add some space, and we'll add our first carousel item inside of it. So we'll write the carousel item class. Then inside of this, we'll have our image. And the image, we're going to give it a class from Bootstrap to make sure that it takes up 100% of the width, no matter how wide or narrow the screen is. And that's going to be a class called w-100. Then we can hit enter and add our image, which is going to be img/carousel1.jpg. So now if we save it and take a look in Chrome, we're not going to see our carousel item with the image show up just yet because we'll need to set an active class for the first carousel item. So next to that class, we'll just add active. And now if we save it, we'll start to see our first of the images appearing. So what we can do to add the other two images is simply copy this and paste it in twice. Then we'll just remove the active class and change it to carousel3.jpg and 2.jpg. So now once we save it, we're going to see that the slides are transitioning through really fast with our current data interval. So I'm going to add a 0 here to make it 6.5 seconds instead of 650ths of a second. And as you can see, this will be a nice transition speed where somebody can read the content on top of the slide before going to the next one. But for now, I'm going to change the data interval to add 2 zeros to the end so it's not transitioning through the slides while we're building the rest of the image slider. Now let's drop down to where we have the carousel indicators HTML comment and add the HTML for the little indicators that will tell us which slide we're on and will act as buttons so we can move to the different slides. So we're going to start this off with an ordered list, which will have a class called carousel-indicators. And then inside of our unordered list, we're going to have a list item for each one of the indicators. So we're going to add li for the list item, and the first one is going to have a class called active, similar to the carousel items. Now what we'll need to do is specify a data target. So basically when we click on one of the carousel indicators, it's going to take us to the carousel itself using the ID that we gave the carousel earlier. So I'll add hashtag carousel for the carousel ID, which wraps around everything. And then we can add the carousel item that we want to slide to. So we'll add the attribute data-slide-to. And the first one in this case is going to be 0. And then the others will be 1 and 2 as opposed to 1, 2, 3. So I'll make sure that this one is 0. And then we can copy the list item once we have the first one set with the active class and paste it in, and then we'll just need to remove the active class for the other two, as well as changing it to data slide to 1, and then for the third one it's going to be data slide to 2. So now if we take a look in Google Chrome, we'll have all three of our carousel indicators set with the inherent size for the carousel before we resize them. So before we get to that, let's make it so our carousel slider has a max height to it, as you see with the finished version, so it doesn't keep expanding in height on really wide screens. So what we'll do to set a max height is we're going to target the carousel inner class. So I'm going to go over to style.css and add carousel inner, then give it a max height of 40 rem, and I'm going to write important to override their inherent style for the carousel inner class. So now if we span the page up and down, we're going to have the max width set to match the finished version. And the next thing that we'll do is before we change the carousel indicators, let's change the speed at which it slides to the next carousel image. To do this, we're going to target two classes that we don't see here, but that start with the carousel-item class. So I'm going to copy that. And what we're going to do is target the carousel-item-next class. So I'll add the period for the class and paste in carousel item, then add dash next and then comma so we can target more classes, and we'll target the previous class with prev in addition to the active class for the carousel item. So we'll add carousel item dot active without any spaces in between. Then we'll add the style declaration transition transform 1.2 seconds ease, as opposed to about half a second, I think, inherently with the Bootstrap carousel. So now if we select the indicator and transition through the slides, we're going to have a nice smooth transition speed, and you can always slow it down to 2 seconds, for example, if you want, but I think that 1.2 seconds looks pretty good. So now with our speed set, what we can do is move on to resizing the carousel indicators. So what we're going to do is target the list items inside of the class that we gave the ordered list. So if you remember in our HTML, we added the carousel-indicators class to the ordered list. So we'll target that in addition to li for the list items. And to show that we can resize the carousel indicators however we want, let's give them a width of 80 pixels and let's give them a height of 10 pixels. So now if we take a look, they're going to be much larger than the finished version. So let's size them down to a height of 6 pixels and a width of 40 pixels. And that's going to look pretty good, except for if we take a look at the finished version, it's going to have a little bit more separation in between them. So let's give them a margin on the right of 4 pixels, and we'll do the same with margin left 4 pixels. And now if we take a look, we'll have it matching up to the finished version other than the content that's on top of our image slider. So let's go ahead and start adding that now. So we're going to get started with the first slide where we have the black background color that's transparent. And then we'll get to the third slide with the light colored transparent background. So let's move back over to index.html and go up to the first carousel item. And I'm going to drop down and add a new class called carousel-caption. Then inside of this, similar to how we would lay out content with the Bootstrap website, we're going to use the container class to set a max width of 1140 pixels. So that will keep our content centered on big screens for us. And then what we're going to do inside of the container is we're going to add our row, which will contain our column. So let's add the row class, and we're also going to add a class that starts with justify-content, and then we can specify whether we want it to be on the end or center. So this is going to be on the end as opposed to the third slide where we won't need to specify it because it's off to the left, which is inherent with HTML. So now with this set, we're ready to start adding our column. So with Bootstrap, we have a way to make it so the column doesn't appear on smaller screens, and then it starts to appear once we get up to larger screens. So if we size the window down to underneath 768 pixels, we'll see that it's not going to display. So what we can do is we can use a class called d-none, which would have the CSS display none to hide our column. And then once we get up to the 768 pixel mark, we're going to have it display. So that's going to be the medium screen width with the Bootstrap breakpoints. So we'll use the MD in reference to that breakpoint with the class d-md block for display block at 768 pixels in width. Then since we're going to start displaying our column at the medium screen width, we'll need to set the number of columns we want to take up out of the 12 column grid system with Bootstrap. So in this case, we're going to take up 11 out of the 12 columns. So it's going to take up almost the full width at this screen size. And we'll use the class col-11-md for it. Then once we get up to the large screen width, which is 992 pixels with Bootstrap, you're going to see that it's going to decrease in the width of the screen. So we're going to make it 9 out of the 12 available columns to us with col-lg-9. Then once that's set, the last breakpoint will be at the 1140 pixel mark, or the XL screen size, and we're going to use up 8 out of the 12 available columns at that width. And then we'll also want to set a background color for it, which will be changing later in the CSS. So Bootstrap has classes to set different background colors. In this case, we're going to use the BG-dark class, and we'll add our custom shade, as I said, in the CSS. And we'll also want to position our text off to the right. So we'll use the class text-right to do that. Then we can hit enter, and our column for the first slide is all set, so we can start adding the content inside of it. So let's start off with the heading 3, and we're going to give this some padding. So as you'll see underneath that responsive website design text, we'll have a little bit of padding underneath of 1 rem using Bootstrap's class padding bottom 3, which represents the 1 rem. And then let's add the text responsive website design. So now if we save it and take a look, we'll have the start of our content on top of the slider, and later we'll reposition this and change the background color as well as add the border radius around it. But for now, let's add the border that appears underneath our heading 3. So with Bootstrap, they have classes set up for us already to add our borders, and we're going to use the class border-top, and then we can specify the color of the border with the class border-white. And then we're going to add some margin to the bottom of this to separate it from the paragraph text with the class MB-3 for margin bottom 1 rem. And we're going to give this a width of 75% of the column. So now if we save it and take a look at the border that we just added in Chrome, we'll see that it's positioned off to the left. So what we're going to do is we're going to position it off to the right using the class ML-auto, which means margin left auto in CSS, giving us the right-handed positioning. Next, let's add the paragraph text that appears underneath the border. So we're going to use the class lead with Bootstrap, which will give us a light font weight as opposed to the normal 400 font weight. This will use the 300 font weight that we have set with the Google font that's added to the file for us already. So the last bit of content that we'll add in our column will be the Learn More button. And we're going to start this off with the anchor text tag with an A and give it a class BTN and then BTN-primary, which is the blue version of the Bootstrap button. Then for the size, we're going to set it to medium with BTN-MD. And for the link, I'm just going to add a hashtag to leave it blank, but you can link to whatever you want for the image slider, whatever you're using it for. Then I'll add the text learn more ... to match the original. And with that, we have our first column set for the first slide of our image slider. So let's move on to the third one before we start adding our style to the column and the content. So let's move back over to index.html and locate the third slide. Then we're going to use some similar classes to the first one with the Carousel caption class. Then inside of that, we'll have our container followed by our row inside of that. And we're not going to need to justify the content because it's going to be positioned off to the left. Then similar to the first slide, we're going to use display none and display MD block to have our column first appear at the medium screen width of 768 pixels. Then the column for the medium screen width, if we size down the screen, it's going to be wider than the first slide at 9 out of the 12 available columns. So we'll use col-md-9. Then once we get up to the large screen width, we're going to use 7 out of the available columns. So you'll see a slight change when we get up to that screen width when it drops in size. And with this column, we're not going to make a change at the extra large screen width. So let's set the background color to white. And we're going to use the class text-dark to give us the black text on top of the white background. So next, let's add our heading 3 where it says mobile friendly. And then underneath that, we'll have our border. And similar to the first, we'll use the border top class with border dark instead of border white. And then we're also going to set some margin to the top bottom with the y-axis of 0.25 rem. with my-1, then we'll also give this a width of 75% of the column with w-75. Okay, so now if we take a look, we'll have our heading 3 and our underline, but our heading 3 is centered for some reason. So let's add the class text-left here, wrapping around the heading 3, or we could add that to the heading 3 itself. And now we can add the paragraph text that appears underneath it. So similar to the first slide, we're going to use the lead class with Bootstrap, which gives us the 300 font weight. And if you don't want to type all this out, you can use lorem. Just type in lorem in Visual Studio Code and it'll give you dummy text. Then underneath the paragraph text, let's add another button. And in this case, we're going to use the btn-light class to give us the white background. And we'll use MD again for the medium size. Then I'll add the learn more ... text. All right, so once we save this, we'll have all of the HTML content for our image carousel set. So we're ready to move over to style.css. So the first thing that we'll do is let's center our columns vertically. And to do this, we're going to target the carousel caption class. So if we scroll up, we can go ahead and copy the carousel caption class and then go over to style.css. So as we know, the carousel caption class, which we'll add now, is inside of the carousel inner, and we're going to give this position absolute, and the absolute positioning is going to allow us to place it wherever we want inside of its parent element, the carousel inner. So we're going to position it 47% from the top, which will start nearly 50% down the carousel inner, or the actual image slider. So what we'll do is we're going to add transform translate y for the vertical y-axis, -50%. So that's going to center our element carousel caption within that top 40% value. So it's going to reverse it 50% of its own height at that 47% point. Now we're ready to move on to adding the background color for the first slide. So what we're going to do is take the bg-dark class that we added, and we're going to apply our own custom background color to it, overriding Bootstrap's color. So let's reference the bg-dark class and then set the background color. So we're going to use RGBA so we can make it transparent with all zeros for black with red, green, blue. And then for the alpha, we'll give it a 30% transparency with 0.7, and we'll also need to add exclamation point important to override Bootstrap's color. And you can change the transparency to your liking. So if we added 0.99 or just 1, it would be solid black, but I'm going to leave it at 0.7 to give it a little bit of transparency. Next, let's round the corners by giving it some border radius in our CSS. With Bootstrap, we could use a class called rounded, but this class won't give us too much border radius, so I'd rather do that in the CSS so we can specify exactly how rounded we want the corners to be. So let's add border radius 1.5 rem, and that's going to match the original. Then let's also add some padding all around inside of the column of 1 rem to space our text out from the edges of the column. And that's going to be applied to just the bg-dark column. So what we'll need to do is also apply that to the third slide. If you remember, we added the bg-white class to the last slide in our image carousel. And what we can do instead of typing everything out is copy the bg-dark CSS and paste that in, then change it to white. And to make the RGBA value white, we'll just change all the zeros to 255 for white. Then the transparency is going to be slightly lighter than the dark version. So we're going to make this 0.65. And now that's going to match the original. So we're ready to add a little bit of styling to our heading 3 next. In case you want to use a heading 3 elsewhere on the website where you may be adding this image slider, let's target the heading 3 inside of the carousel caption class instead of just targeting the heading 3 itself. So I'm going to copy the carousel caption text, and then we can paste that class in underneath the bg-white class, then add h3. And let's decrease the font weight to 300, which will be similar to the paragraph lead class. So that's going to use the 300 font weight from our Google font. And next, let's increase the font size a little bit to match the original. So we're going to give it a font size of 2.3 rem, which is about 40 pixels given the font size large that's applied to the reset style in style.css. Then let's also increase the font size of the paragraph lead text slightly. So if you remember, we added that lead class to our paragraphs that we see right here. So we're going to add P for the paragraph followed by .lead for the class. And let's increase the font size to 1.4 rem from 1.1 rem. So now if we take a look in Chrome and we toggle back and forth, we'll see that it's not going to match up until we're above the extra large screen width. So what we're going to do is change the CSS for the heading 3 and the paragraph text once we get underneath 1200 pixels in width. So as of right now, if we size down the version we've been working on here to underneath 1200 pixels, it's not going to decrease in size, but if we toggle to the original, there we have the smaller heading 3 and paragraph lead text. So let's drop down to the first media query underneath 1200 pixels. And what we can do is simply copy the heading 3 CSS that we added already, and then we'll decrease the font size to 1.8 rem from 2.3. Okay, so now that that's set, next let's resize the paragraph text as well to make it slightly smaller. So we're going to bring down the paragraph lead text to match the original from 1.4 rem, which we have right here. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it underneath the heading 3 to 1.2 rem. So now if we take a look, we have our resized heading 3 and paragraph text, at least on our version. I guess the finished version, I didn't resize the paragraph text, but that's okay. So now the last thing that we'll do is let's change the carousel indicator. So if you remember, we resized them at the full width CSS. So let's bring that CSS down here and we're going to decrease it. So let's make the width 30 pixels, the height 4 pixels, and then the margin 3 pixels right and left. Okay, so now we have the smaller carousel indicators on the smaller screens, and that concludes the entire image carousel slider design. And the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back to index.html to remove those 2 zeros from the data interval. So we're back to 6.5 seconds instead of having it still. Okay, so that does it for building our carousel image slider. I want to thank you for watching. Please remember to like the video if you haven't already, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. Then I'll see you in the next video, and I thank you for watching.